August 14, 1973. Hong Kong, just after 2 in the afternoon. The document was 12 pages long. Most of it was technical in the specific way that medical documentation from this era tends to be technical. Dense with clinical terminology, measurements recorded in units that meant nothing without the context to read them, the particular bloodless language that pathology uses to describe what was once a person. It had been prepared in the weeks following Bruce Lee's death on July 20th, as part of the coroner's process that would lead to the inquest and eventually to the verdict of death by misadventure. It had been reviewed by multiple doctors. It had been entered into the official record. It existed in the way that official documents from coroner's proceedings exist, as a piece of the permanent archive of what the medical system determined had happened. And on page 7, in the margin next to a single word in the pathology findings, someone had drawn a circle in red ink. Not a notation, not an annotation with accompanying explanation, just a circle around one word. The circle was not part of the official document. It was added by hand by someone who had access to the document after it was finalized, someone who read it carefully enough to stop at that word, to reach for something to write with, and to mark it in a way that said, "This. This is the thing that doesn't fit." No doctor connected to the official proceedings ever explained it. The word that was circled has been described in the account that brought it to my attention, but never reproduced in full in any public record I have been able to locate. And the person who drew the circle, whose identity is known to the source of this account, and known to at least one researcher who looked into this in the early 1980s and then stopped, has never spoken publicly about why they marked it, or what they understood it to mean, or whether they ever raised the question it implied with anyone who had the authority to answer it. That is where this investigation begins, not with the word itself, with the circle, to understand why a single circled word in the margin of a coroner's document matters, why it is worth spending serious time on, why the people who have encountered it have consistently found it difficult to set aside. You have to understand what the document surrounding it was supposed to establish and what the medical and legal environment of 1973 Hong Kong was equipped to establish, and where those two things diverged. Bruce Lee died on July 20th, 1973. He was 32 years old. He was 5 feet 7 inches and had, for most of his adult life, weighed 135 pounds. A weight he maintained with the specific discipline of someone who understood his body as both instrument and argument, who had spent years developing a physical self that was the most direct possible rebuttal to every institution that had told him what an Asian man in Western entertainment could and could not be. He was found unresponsive at the apartment of Betty Ting Pei on Cumberland Road. He was taken to Queen Elizabeth Hospital. He was pronounced dead. The official cause, established by the coroner's inquest that concluded in September 1973, was cerebral edema, swelling of the brain, attributed to a hypersensitivity reaction to meprobamate, an ingredient in a painkiller called Equagesic that he had taken for a headache that afternoon. That is the documented record. It is the record that has stood for 50 years. What the autopsy document contained, all of what it contained, not just the findings that supported the official cause, is a question that has occupied a small number of serious researchers and a much larger number of less serious ones in the decades since. The serious ones tend to reach the same place, a recognition that the document is not fully accessible in the form that would allow its complete contents to be independently evaluated, and that the fragments of it that have entered the public record through various channels are not sufficient to either confirm or refute the official conclusion with the kind of certainty the question deserves. The red circle is one of those fragments. It arrived in the account that forms the basis of this investigation through a chain of transmission that I want to be precise about. A person who had direct access to the document described what they saw to a second person, who recorded the description in notes that a third person eventually shared with a researcher working on a larger project about the Hong Kong film industry in the early 1970s. That researcher made a choice, for reasons I don't fully understand and cannot fully account for, not to pursue it further. The notes passed through one more set of hands before they reached someone who understood what they were looking at and began asking the questions that eventually, indirectly, reached me. I want to be clear about what this chain means for the reliability of what I'm going to tell you. It means I am working at significant distance from the primary source. It means the description of the circled word is a description of a description, filtered through memory and through the choices that each person in the chain made about what to record, what to emphasize, and what to leave out. The essential claim that a word in the pathology findings was circled in red by an unidentified person and never explained is consistent across all the versions of this account I have been able to access. The specific word is where the accounts become less consistent, and I will address that directly when we get there. This is a moment, early in the investigation, where I need to check my own instincts. Because here is the thing that struck me when I first encountered this account, and that I have been sitting with in the months since. My initial reaction to the red circle was the same reaction most people probably have, which is that it feels like evidence of something being suppressed or concealed. The circle is signal. The circle is someone trying to communicate what they couldn't say out loud, and that reading is possible. I don't want to dismiss it, but the more time I have spent with it, the more I have come to think that this reading, the suppression reading, might be the less interesting one, and it might not be the accurate one. The more I look at this, the more the circle reads to me as something simpler and in some ways more troubling. The mark of a person who encountered something they didn't understand, who lacked the authority or the context or the courage to raise it formally, and who left a mark in a margin as the only record of their own confusion. That is a different kind of evidence than suppression. It is evidence of a gap, not a conspiracy, but a failure of the system to fully process what it had in front of it. And that gap, in the context of what we know about the medical and investigative infrastructure of 1973 Hong Kong, is not particularly surprising. It is, in fact, exactly what you would expect. The Hong Kong medical establishment in 1973 was operating under constraints that are worth understanding clearly. The coroner's system was functional, but not sophisticated in the ways that, say, a major American or British medical institution would have been sophisticated at that time. Forensic pathology as a discipline was less developed. The resources available for investigating unusual findings in an autopsy, the capacity to follow an unexpected result into territory that the initial hypothesis did not anticipate, were limited in ways that affected what any individual examining the document could do with an anomaly they identified. To circle something was, in that environment, potentially the limit of what the person doing the circling was equipped to do with it. That context matters. It does not resolve the question of what the word was, but it changes the frame around the circle itself. The Enter the Dragon production had wrapped in March 1973, after a shoot that ran from January through the end of that month. Warner Brothers cameras inside Golden Harvest's sound stages on Hammer Hill Road in Kowloon for the first time, a production that everyone involved understood as the proof of concept for something that had never been attempted at that scale. The harbor smell of salt and diesel found its way into the studio between takes. The concrete block construction held the summer heat on the indoor stages until the air barely moved. By the time the shoot concluded, people who knew Bruce Lee well enough to observe him carefully were noting that he looked different than he had at the beginning of the production. Not worse, exactly. Different. Thinner in a way that sat differently on the frame than training thin sits. the specific quality of a body that has been giving at a rate that isn't quite being matched by what it's receiving. Bruce Lee had navigated the 1970 back injury, partial sacral nerve damage from a barbell exercise performed with excessive weight, months bedridden, doctors who told him he might never return to full training capacity, a recovery that he used to develop the philosophical architecture that would define everything he built afterward. He had navigated the Kung Fu television series, which gave the lead role to a white actor, while he watched the idea he had helped develop become something that wasn't quite his, in a Hollywood that had made clear to him, repeatedly and through specific institutional behavior, that an Asian man could not be the center of an American story for an American audience. He had navigated all of it by converting it into material, by treating every obstacle as something to absorb and transform, rather than something to be defeated by. What the autopsy document found, or what it found that prompted the red circle, sits inside that biographical context. A body that had been under extraordinary sustained pressure, a man who had trained himself to push past the signals that would have stopped other people. The specific question of whether the physical findings in that document told a story that the me probamate hypothesis on its own accounted for completely. Here is where the honest accounting of the record gets most difficult to navigate, and I want to be straight with you about exactly where the ground becomes uncertain. The word that was circled, the specific clinical term that appeared in the pathology findings and that someone marked as requiring attention, has been described in different accounts in ways that point toward the same general territory without converging on the same specific language. One account uses a term related to neurological findings. Another uses language that suggests something about tissue condition. A third, less specific, says only that it was a finding that did not fit cleanly into the reaction hypothesis as the sole cause. These three descriptions are not contradictory. They could all be describing different aspects of the same finding. They could be describing different findings in different parts of the document. I cannot tell you which, because I do not have access to the document itself, and the accounts I have are not precise enough to resolve this. What I can tell you is that every version of this account agrees on one thing. The word that was circled was not standard. It was not a finding that appeared routinely in autopsy reports from deaths with similar official causes. The person who circled it had enough medical literacy to recognize that it was anomalous, and not enough institutional authority, or not enough institutional will, to do anything with that recognition except mark it and move on. The question that anomaly implies, what it might mean for the completeness of the official conclusion, whether it points toward something the official record absorbed without fully processing, is the question that the red circle has been asking in a margin for 50 years. Something I want to put to you directly, because I find I genuinely cannot decide what weight to give it, and I'd rather know how it lands for you than sit with it alone. The person who drew that circle made a choice, not the choice to suppress it. There's no evidence of active suppression in the account, no one being told not to speak. The choice to mark it privately instead of raising it formally. To leave a trace in the document rather than a statement in the record. There is a version of that choice that is cowardice. There is a version that is prudence, a person in a position with limited power making a judgment about what they could and could not force the system to address. There is a version that is something harder to name, the mark of someone who understood that they were looking at something important and also understood that the moment for that something to be fully examined had already somehow passed. Which of those versions you believe changes everything about what the circle means? I don't know which one is right. Tell me which one reads as true to you, because this is the part of this story I keep returning to, and I cannot find stable ground in it. The inquest concluded in September 1973, death by misadventure. The document with the red circle was part of the record that supported that conclusion, or was at least part of the record reviewed in arriving at it. Whether the circled word was raised during the inquest proceedings, whether whoever drew that circle was present, was called, said anything, is not established in any account I have found. The inquest proceedings are partially documented in public record. They do not contain any reference to an anomalous finding that required separate explanation. That absence could mean many things. The circled word could have been reviewed and determined to be irrelevant to the cause of death. It could have been considered and found consistent with the official hypothesis through a chain of reasoning that the document itself does not make explicit. It could have been missed in the press of a high-profile inquest conducted under significant public and commercial pressure in a system not fully equipped to chase every thread. Or it could mean that the circle stayed in the margin, and the margin stayed in the document, and the document entered the archive, and no one with the authority to ask the question it implied ever asked it. Bruce Lee had written in the notebooks that he filled during the months of enforced stillness after his back injury, the same notebooks whose entries have been partially reproduced in various accounts, whose handwriting people who knew him well would have recognized immediately, that placing limits on what you do physically or in any other direction will spread into your work and into your life. He meant it as a call to push past self-imposed restriction. He built a philosophy around it that was true in every way he lived it. But a body has its own record, its own document, its own annotations in margins that no philosophy of will can fully overwrite. The autopsy findings are that record. 12 pages of what his body had accumulated and what it had been carrying in the language of pathology rather than the language of intention. And somewhere on page 7 of that record, one word sits inside a red circle that no doctor ever explained. The circle is still there. In a document in an archive in Hong Kong, or in whatever condition 50 years has left it. A hand reached for a pen or a pencil, the accounts don't specify, and drew a shape around a word and put the document down. Whatever the word was, it was enough to make someone stop. Whatever it meant, it was not enough to make anyone speak. That is not the story of a conspiracy. It is the story of how much can be present in a record and still go unanswered. How a single mark in a margin can carry a question that the official apparatus around it was not designed or not willing to fully hold. The man who left those notebooks, who trained that body to its absolute limit, who created opportunities where every institutional structure told him none existed. He deserved the question to be asked completely and answered completely and put into a record that could stand without anything circled in its margin. 50 years later, the circle remains, and the word inside it has never been explained.